Okay, so knowing your shapes and triggers. So, throughout abstract reasoning, you will become very familiar with the shapes that you come across. But it's good to know them a little bit more. So you will come across a plus sign, a lightning bolt, a star, and an arrow. Now you need to know how many sides each of them usually have, because obviously there are a lot of sides to count and that wastes a lot of time. So just knowing every time you see a plus sign, so that looks like this, that it has 12 sides. Every time you see a lightning bolt, you know it has 11 sides. Every time you see a star, you know it has 10 sides. Every time you see an arrow, a normal arrow, you know it has 7 sides. So also consider the number of right angles in letters. So you've got F has 3 right angles, H has 4, L has 1, T has 2, and E has 4. Now it can be quite common to find patterns where you have to count the number of sides, which is why it's a good idea just knowing how many sides these shapes have, because they just take a lot of time counting the number of sides, and sometimes you might forget where you started off when you counted the number of sides, and I've been through it. Just don't do it. Just memorize the number of sides for these shapes. So just like how you are able to look at a square, look at a circle, look at a pentagon, look at a triangle, you just know immediately how many sides it has. The same again for the plus sign, the lightning bolt, the star, and the arrow. You just need to know immediately off the back of your hand, you know, that's how many sides it has. Now let's take a look at triggers. Now every time you look at certain shapes, certain features, certain characteristics, they sometimes act as triggers as to what the pattern could possibly be. So let's take a look at curved shapes. So that is a trigger. Now curved shapes can act as an indicator whether the pattern could possibly be curved versus straight. Now sometimes triangles can indicate some sort of direction, so it could be something like this, that all the triangles are pointing up, and set B, all the triangles are pointing down. So every time you see lots of triangles, then assume some sort of direction. Number 3, grey, stripes, and spotted. So these could act as a trigger for colors. So you might have 2 spotted shapes and 1 striped shape and 1 grey shape in a set, and set B has slightly different, so these could act as a trigger for colors. Number 4, clocks. Every time you see clocks, think of angles. Number 5, arrows. They are indicating some sort of direction, so they are possibly pointing towards something or a certain direction, or it could possibly be counting up the number of arrowheads per box within a set. Number 6, big and small shapes. So think of numbers, the number of big shapes and the number of little shapes. Number 7, this is the most difficult pattern throughout the whole abstract reasoning section, and it did come up for my UCAT exam, but because I practiced a lot and I recognized this pattern, I was able to attempt this. So if you see the same types of shape in each set, so in each box, and it's obvious to you, well then think of assigning each of those shapes a number of points. So this is a little example here. So circle equals 1, triangle equals 2, square equals 3. Now if we were to add up the total numbers for each of these, so circle equals 1, so 1 plus 1 plus 2 makes 4. Now for this box here, circle equals 1, so 1 plus 3, so square equals 3, and that also equals 4. So set A has shapes which add up to points of 4. So something like that, and that is very, very hard to identify sometimes. And that's because we're so attracted towards like numbers and the number of sides and the number of shapes. Rather, this one is very hard. 8, very few shapes. So if you find a single shape in a box, think odd versus even. So think of something like odd versus even. So the number of sides is odd or the number of sides is even for set B, but it's not always, but quite often it is. Number 9, smiley faces. Think of enclosures, so the number of enclosed spaces. Number 10, rectangles, squares, right angle triangles. Think, every time you see them, think of right angle triangles. And number 11, simple shapes. Every time you see simple shapes, then think of lines of symmetry. Now, these triggers will help you speed up identifying certain patterns. Every time you see curved shapes, you want to think curved versus straight. Every time you see triangles, you want to think of some sort of direction. Or every time you see arrows, you want to think of counting the number of arrowheads or looking whether they are all pointing in a certain direction. So every time you see certain different shapes, obviously it will act as a trigger for a certain pattern. So now the more practice you do, you can add more to this list as well. So you can do a bit of analyzing on Medify and see which certain shapes could possibly act as a trigger, or which certain characteristic of a shape could possibly act as a trigger.